Today on this episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing cultivated meat, the future of food, with founder and CEO of GOODHUMANS Strategy Design Agency and VP at Upside Foods, Dr. Eric Schulze. Learn how technology has allowed scientists to produce animal tissues in the lab and the major worldwide implications of this development on the food industry. Much more on this podcast episode. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Dr. Eric Schulze. He is a nationally recognized molecular biologist for a reason. His pioneering approach centered on the cultivation of meat products will undoubtedly revolutionize the food industry. Currently, the rising demand for meat across the globe raises many dilemmas, from ethical to environmental to financial. In fact, many experts have stated that our own meat industry is growing so fast that it is simply not sustainable. In response to this dilemma, Dr. Schulze has undertaken what was previously considered science fiction and turned it into reality, cultivating meat in a laboratory from single cells. I know what many of you are thinking. That's not really meat. That can't be healthy. No way that replaces our current meat industry. Well, I have news for you. It is real meat, just doesn't involve slaughtering animals. It is just as healthy as conventional meat products, and if given the appropriate financial support, could very well take over the meat industry in the next decade. I really enjoyed this interview as I started to envision the impact of this novel technology. By foregoing raising and slaughtering animals, companies like Upside Food will be able to solve many of the serious drawbacks associated with the meat industry. The only question will be public acceptance. So what's your view? Meat from a petri dish, a delicacy or disgusting? Listen up as we discuss cultivated meat, the future of food. Check it out. Hey, Eric, how you doing?
Peachy keen. How are you?
I'm good. Excited to have you on the podcast today to talk about what I think is going to be the future of the meat industry that's growing so rapidly. Talking about essentially cultivated meat and the science behind it, the benefits, and where the field is going. So welcome, and very excited to hear your input.
I'm excited. Let's get into it.
So let's start with the science, since you're an engineer and you're a biological engineer.
That's right.
Is that correct?
That's right.
So the science behind it, tell us exactly what is cultivated or lab-grown meat, and what is the technique for its production?
So cultivated meat, the process is incredibly simple, and just like most things in science and engineering, just very hard to execute on. Cultivated meat is simply growing animal meat directly from an animal, it's actual real meat, except you're just not growing it in an animal's body. Instead, you're growing it outside of the animal's body in what looks basically like a beer fermentation tank. So you're growing muscle tissue, connective tissue, fat tissue, and you're doing that outside of the animal. In very simple terms, you take a small sample of cells, and as you well know, there are different tissue types in the human body that you have to navigate. So you take a small sample, about a rice grain sized amount of tissue, muscle tissue, and of course in muscle there's fat, connective tissue, all those cells in there. And then you take them into a very clean facility, isolate those cells. So if I just want to grow muscle, I'll grab a few of those, and then effectively those cells are running their genetic programming. They're alive, and as long as you give them warmth, vitamins, minerals, sugars, water, and some oxygen, they'll continue to grow. So we basically put them in a giant swimming pool full of their food, and they will continue to grow. And in a very short amount of time, because they don't have to do anything but grow and make meat, you have a lot of meat in a very short amount of time. You harvest it, you process it just like you would any meat product using the same equipment you would do if you had a cow present. And then you eat it, which is the best part. So in a nutshell, it's just the same process an animal would do, just highly simplified and outside of the body.
How long has this technique been around for?
The idea of cultivated meat has been around, goodness, over 100 years. And heck, you don't even have to be a scientist to have known about it. Um, Winston Churchill, famed prime minister of the UK, famously scribbled some notes over 50 years ago and just sort of prognosticated about what he thought the future might entail. And one of those very specific prognostications was how absurd it was to have to grow an entire animal if you just wanted to eat the wing or the drumstick, and that he thought you could just grow a part of it that you wanted. So, not an entirely foreign idea, very common in sci-fi tropes and all that stuff as well. What was different about this, and when I joined the field to help build it, was that no one had attempted to commercialize it. No one had attempted to actually make it cost effective, because scientifically, people had been growing meat in labs in very small quantities for 50 years. But just again, when I joined Upside Foods in 2016, that was the very first company to ever attempt to commercialize it. So quite an old idea.
Now let's hear about because you've had quite the career and you got involved with Upside Foods, which is currently the leader in this field. But what was your impetus for helping build Upside Foods?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, the short answer is I joined Upside at the time because of Reddit. I saw a post claiming that someone had figured out how to reduce the cost of growing cultivated meat from back when Google had figured it out. And if you remember in 2011, someone had grown a lab grown, quote unquote, a lab grown hamburger for roughly the equivalent of about $300,000 a pound. And I was, and that's like pharma prices. So they had figured out and gotten it down to 18,000, which is still eye watering, right? But that's a huge order of magnitude difference. And I was like, oh, I think I could help. I think there's a way to do this cheaper. And more importantly, just like personally, I love meat. I eat meat. I'm not going to stop eating meat. I smoke meats on the weekends because I'm from Texas, and I'm very motivated to resolve my cognitive dissonance about what I'm doing. And I think a lot of people feel like me. Like they know what they're doing in the back of their mind probably isn't great, whether it be for the planet, for the animals, whatever, pick your poison. And I'm very motivated as a scientist. I was like, if I can solve this, I can just switch over to this sort of guiltless, guilt-free version where I don't have to eat a plant-based burger. I can eat actual animal meat.
Yeah, it's a great concept. And, for people who don't know much about Upside Foods, what range of products are offered? What types of meats can you get through Upside Foods?
It's been a hot minute since I've been at Upside, but they have released and are currently selling a chicken fillet, basically, and it is tissue. So you have two types of products in cultivated meat. You have the sort of tissue product that's cohesive. It represents, it's all bound together, grown like it would an animal. And then you have these so-called hybrid products, which are just individual cells that are kind of glued together using traditional food ingredients, like pea protein or something like that. And most companies are doing the latter. It's cheaper. It's much more efficient. You can grow more. But the tissue product is sort of the gold standard, and that's what's on market right now from Upside. But I'm fairly certain they're going to be releasing a multitude of retail products that are hybrid in nature and are still tasty and wonderful. But I think that those are probably coming, I would assume, in the next year or so. And then also across the globe in Singapore, you can purchase small amounts of cultivated meat from Vow, who's doing a cultured quail product. Vow Foods, they're out of Australia. And then Good Meat basically just also launched in Singapore and also in the United States, but I don't believe they're on market currently. But the goal, of course, is get it in as many people's hands as possible.
Now, I know you said this already. I just want to re-emphasize because it's the biggest hurdle, but everyone will ask, is this quote unquote real meat? And please,
Sure.
if you could just demystify
Yeah.
that concept.
How about I take, first off, I worked formerly in the U.S. government as a federal regulator for novel foods and drugs. And as a scientist, I think it's super important to have a working knowledge and practice of both policy and science. Because again, you probably know as well, working in the medical field, you can't divorce the fact that science and medicine are a part of the culture and society in which we live. Therefore, it's subject to the cultural mores of that time, right? So you have to be aware of like, what do people think? How are they currently defining something? How are they? And so with meat, in the policy and the regulations, meat is simply defined as sort of the parts of the animal that come off of a carcass, a slaughtered animal. We say slaughter, meaning you kill an animal for food. We took that a step further when I was at Upside, because I ran the policy shop, and further defined sort of, you don't have to think about this, but like, what is meat? Like, if you were to define it, what is it? Well, you don't eat the living tissue off of an animal. It has to be from a slaughtered animal. So it's the parts of an animal we traditionally consume as food. It's 3 parts to a definition. The second part is it has to be from a part of the animal we traditionally consume as food. And then third, it has to be non-viable prior to consumption. It has to be dead. And that traditionally means skeletal muscle, connective tissue, fats, and traditionally sort of excludes bone and organs, although obviously many cultures consume the organs. But in the West, it's typically skeletal muscle. So from that definition, cultivated meat is meat. It is animal meat. And the most fundamental definition for me is, even if you take that away, is it's genetically from the same parts of the animal that we eat. So it is muscle tissue. It is connective tissue. You would not be able to differentiate them under a microscope. The difference might be, if there are any, at the molecular level, there might not be this exact same ratios of cells, although that can be controlled. But nutritionally, genetically, and taste-wise, and the way it cooks, it's meat. Like, there's no mistaking it. I've watched thousands of people try these products that I have helped design, and even the most ardent meat eater has had real trouble actually distinguishing them from conventional products, and they definitely can distinguish them from plant-based products.
So going over those again, you just said it, but again, I want to reemphasize. Nutritionally, the exact same as getting it from the
Correct.
slaughtered animal, and the taste, people cannot differentiate between cultivated versus farm grown and slaughtered.
And the one thing that I think like less thought about, but also how it handles and as cooks, this is one of the things why working with professional chefs has been really helpful, is the way it handles those subtle things that you just kind of notice when you're working with products in the kitchen. Is like, it browns the same way. It smells the same when you cook it. You get that Maillard-y, crusty caramelization. It has the same smells when you cook it. And then most importantly, when you bite into it, you get that toothsome, like tenderness, but also chewiness. And the juices that are released are also incredibly familiar. So a lot of the time that I spent with my teams when we were designing these products was spent on the sensory experience, the visual appearance, and less so maybe on the genetics, like, because we knew those would be the same. It was just an incredible amount of time to optimize things that you don't even think about, but are evolutionarily hardwired into you if you consume meat, that you would immediately notice are off or slightly off. And that's probably where we spent the most amount of time designing these products, was to make it as imperceptibly mundane as possible.
Now tell us, how long does the entire process take, right? From the time that you harvest that piece of meat that's the size of a grain of rice until the final food product is ready for consumption. What does that growth process look like?
It's going to vary by like producer. But in general, the most time it would take to sort of run a production run is like 3 weeks. Keep in mind, a cow from birth to on a grocery store shelf is anywhere between 18 months and 3 years. So 3 weeks is incredibly short. Now, cells divide roughly once a day, maybe a little less in a cultivation system. So the shortest you can get it is somewhere around a week. And then if you're doing it really efficiently, you can be doing it every other day, where you're harvesting a load of cells, a production run, as they grow. And that's just simply because of the law of exponents. But at most 3 weeks, and generally within a week or so. Chickens take 6 weeks to mature right now, which is, by the way, incredible that we have gotten it down to 6 weeks. And then obviously, like, cows are the longest, pigs are in the middle somewhere. And so all of this is to say, like, you save a lot of energy and time and resources just on the shortness it takes of being able to cultivate these products.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here, which is part of the role of this podcast. But so processed foods have been shown to have health consequences. For example, margarine, GMOs. Currently, a very big push for organic, farm to table foods. How does your company fit into this
Sure.
scheme?
Well, again, I'm going to put my policy hat on for a second. Organic guidelines are not science-based. Organic guidelines were set up by here in the U.S. as under USDA for marketing purposes to protect small farmers. It was a very noble effort, and has been incredibly successful. It has obviously transformed into one of the largest food industries. But organic guidelines, just as an example, are not based on a sort of a logical, rational system of science. That said, there are pathways for cultivated meat to become certified as organic. From a health perspective, again, if you're just doing apples to apples comparisons, certain meat products will have, for example, certain red meats. Obviously, you know this as a medical doctor. There are risks associated with consuming large amounts of red meats. You would have those same risks with cultivated meat. And again, that's not to put cultivated meat down, but that's how similar they are. The nice thing about this is that you can tune the nutritional profiles. So you can change those sorts of saturated fat profiles. You can increase omega-3 fatty acid or omega-3 6 ratios in those products. You can target the micronutrient profile to make them effectively be enriched, if you will, at the biological level to have a certain flavor profile, nutritional profile. I think of ultra processed and processed foods are typically defined as basically emulsified foams. Like, the degree of emulsification is what defines an ultra processed product. But all food's processed. If you are eating an animal, you must process its carcass to some degree so that you can consume it. So in that sense, I think like cultivated meat is actually incredibly have a low degree of processing. There's less steps involved to grow this because it literally is sell, grow, eat. Whereas an animal needs to be born, coddled, fed, treated with veterinary drugs, slaughtered, processed. There's less degrees and fewer degrees of processing for cultivated meat. So actually, it's a more holistically pure product from a production standpoint than traditional agriculture. And that's not to put down traditional agriculture. I just think the simple fact is that science and technology actually can bring about sort of more, instead of seeing science and technology as sort of processing our food further and further, in this case, I think science and technology has actually brought us towards more a platonic ideal, more, if you will, of like a sort of nutritional product. Now, to be fair, not every cultivated meat product is going to be a paradigm of health. There are still ways that we still haven't figured out how to control the cells perfectly. So I won't say that like every aspect can be controlled yet, but I think from a where the field is going standpoint, the products that are coming out are definitely targeting sort of this incredibly ultra low processed paradigm just by the nature of the way they're produced.
Now, you mentioned earlier how the nutrient medium is so critical, and we always judge the quality of meats by what the animal eats, right? Organic, what are they being fed? Are there hormones? Is it processed? So, how do you control the medium that these cultivated meats are grown in, and what are the environmental and health
Yeah,
impacts?
such a great question. The culture media, the food that a cell eats, because they don't have a digestive system, for those of you listening, The cells must sort of just passively absorb what's present. And so think of if you were swimming in a swimming pool and you had a scuba tank on and you were just sort of in the ocean under the sea and you had to catch your food. It's very similar to the idea of like random fish sort of swimming by and you have a spear that you have to stick into one of the fish, capture it, and then that would be your meal. You're dependent on what comes by you and how often and if you can reach it. This is similar to what the cell is seeing in the culture at a molecular level. So you have to tailor it so there's just enough of everything, because feed, the components, the vitamins, the minerals, the glucose, the fats, those are expensive to purchase in a purified form. We mix them into effectively an enriched Gatorade. And they're about 80% of the per pound cost of cultivated meat currently. So it's really expensive. So you want to put just enough food in there for them to grow and do what they need, but not enough that you would waste it effectively, because once it's in, you can't get it back. So that's one aspect, just the cost. The second, of course, is the design and like the food, you are what you eat, and it's no different for the cells. So if they're absorbing certain nutrients in excess, you could get, like, for example, excess saturated fat profiles. You could get products that are nutrient depleted, frankly. But ideally, what you do is, like at Upside, for example, they had an entire team of people. Their entire job is to design the culture medias for different applications, different species, different breeds of animals, and then on top of it, different eating experiences. So the cool part is, like with an animal, you would feed it, and then you wouldn't know if it worked until you'd slaughtered the animal 6 weeks, years later. With cultivated meat, you can walk down a hallway, ask a person, and then within a day you have an answer, and then you can change it. So the cool part is that you can test and iterate an incredibly order of magnitude faster. So for cultivated companies, the goal is, frankly, get costs down by optimizing the food. And then second, making sure that that food represents a food product you want to eat, frankly, and buy.
What about hormones and antibiotics? Are those at all in play with your
It
cultivated
depends
meat process?
on the producer, but in general, when you take from an animal that's on a farm, it's not living in the cleanest environment. So to make sure you add a small amount of antibiotics when you bring it into the culture, and I'm talking, like you're talking drops of liquid, they're used to make sure that the livestock don't contaminate the cultures, because bacteria grow much faster than animal cells. But after that, you don't use them, and they're definitely not used in production. And as you know, antibiotics are not allowed to be in food. Under federal regulation, you cannot have antibiotics in the meat you eat. Now, animals are given antibiotics when they're sick, when they're on the hoof. However, there's explicit regulations in testing that say you have to withdraw that antibiotic, and you have a 30 or 45-day withdraw period before you can slaughter that animal, which you have to test for, so that there's no antibiotic residues in the meat. And then there's no antibiotics allowed. And that's a common sort of marketing trick that say, like, no antibiotics used in chickens. You're not allowed to put antibiotics in food by federal law. So sort of marketing sleight of hand. However, the other aspect to this, of course, is growth factors and hormones. Yes, there's growth factors and hormones in all meats, all plants. Everything you eat uses growth factors and hormones, as you know, to coordinate cellular activity. They're the messengers between cells. That's how we talk, how they talk to each other. Without it, life would not be possible. So we've been eating them, obviously, our entire history as a species. So they're used for the same purpose in culture as well. So yes, they'll use growth factors to sort of coordinate the cells, grow a lot more, differentiate, turn into muscle, turn into connective tissue, what have you. But again, not in any amounts that wouldn't be seen in animal meat.
Yeah, so it's just normal physiology. What would you say are the three biggest benefits of cultivated meat?
I mean, the obvious one, and I think the most important, candidly, is this idea that I know there's a lot of people that don't necessarily believe this, but as a scientist, I'm in the majority of people that do. Like, that we live in a climate changing world. 99% of scientists agree that The world is changing due to human interventions, human activities, and at a rate that's accelerating. Now, what do they say? The best time to the best time to quit something, or the best time to change is now. Like, there's, yes, you can regret doing things later. I think where the way we're looking at cultivated meat is, you have to do something now. We need shots on goal. We need to try other ways of making food for a world that may be much harder to produce. We're going to have 10 billion people, a million and 1.5 billion more than today. Meat demand is going up, not down, as countries are becoming more wealthy. And then, of course, prices tend to go up with it. The meat industry is over half of the entire food industry. And the way we do it currently is just, there's this one way. We have many ways of growing crops. We only have one way of growing animals. So one way is climate change. The second one, of course, is, I guess this is a much more personal one, I think, but a lot of people share it, is like, I don't want to give up eating meat. There's a selfish part of me that just like really wants to keep eating this. And I don't want to contribute to the problem also, but I am. So why don't we use science and technology is often portrayed in sci-fi as sort of the harbinger of death, the harbinger of our way of life changing fundamentally, but for negative ways. Like, we can never go back once we ring the bell. You can't unring it. But I personally believe that science and technology can be our bridge to our cultural past. Like, we're going to use science and technology to keep doing the thing we love doing. Like, I want to keep eating meat off the bone. I want to keep eating animal meat. So I'm going to use science and technology to keep that cultural tradition that we've had for 2 million years. I want to keep it going. I don't want to have to switch over to a plant-based burger. So there's a selfish part of that. And I think a lot of people agree with that. For other people, there's animal rights reasons. For other people, there's cost reasons. There's a million reasons. Meat is so pervasive, but 9 out of 10 people on this planet eat meat every day, and they have for 250,000 years. And the last thing I'll say about that, to the last point, is plant-based burgers and what have you, which are good, have not made a dent in people's buying purchases. 9 out of 10 people still buy meat. It hasn't changed. I think that down the road, plant-based will end up figuring out a way to mimic meat really closely, and then at that point we might see some changes. But until then, I think our best bet is to grow meat in different ways. And with my agency and the things that I'm doing now at Good Humans, we're trying to launch companies that basically create shots on goal and create competition with conventional meat and cultivated meat to try to bring new products to market, so that we have innovation that doesn't allow us going, well, I guess I'm stuck with a plant burger.
Are there any negatives to cultivated meat?
Cost, scale right now. Like, it's not magic. It's not magic. It's getting to scale. If somebody charged you with a way to scalably do precise brain surgery and said, you will unlock billions of dollars in capital. If somebody said, if there was a way for one surgeon to do simultaneously, the best surgeon like yourself, like 15 surgeries simultaneously, but on different patients for different ways, and said, you got to figure out a way to do this thing, or a way of life changes irreparably. I think you could figure out a way to do it. It would just be very expensive. If there was a way to partition your mind virtually and you could work on multiple people simultaneously, but your hands and your expertise were the one doing it, and if people wanted it, they would pay for it. That's where we are with cultivated meat. Figuring out a way to scale and get it into people's hands.
And I guess the other question there that kind of comes up, and it's more of an ethical question, is the food inequity, right? There's countries that are super poor, super rich, countries in famine, countries with too much food. Have you guys even thought ahead and food inequity with this industry because it's so expensive?
Absolutely. And like most industries, you start low volume, high margin, so high price products. as you figure out scale with the intention of everyone in the space is trying to get to retail, QSRs, restaurants. But most importantly, the unique part of this is early on, like we were proposing these models where you can take over really like difficult spaces to rent in commercial real estate, cities, urban environments, and then hard to reach areas because these products are shelf stable. It's imagine a raw chicken product that doesn't have any bacteria, doesn't degrade the same way chicken. There's no risk of salmonella or campylobacter. Like you're not going to have the same food safety issues. So in theory, you could produce or ship these products to a certain extent unrefrigerated, which is a huge cost driver. You don't need reliable where there's unreliable power and storage in like countries where or war zones or what have you, battle areas. You can keep these products or produce them using the cattle or the livestock that's important to that culture. So yes, there's a definite push to like once we lock in scaling effects is like putting these plants, which are frankly no larger than, in some ways you could build an operating plant no larger than an apartment, in places that they're needed, using and not have to rely on of course the most important thing is reliable energy, but for storage of these products you don't even need reliable refrigeration.
Now, you mentioned earlier that I guess there is cultivated meat in Asia. What other countries besides the U.S. offer cultivated
So
meat?
right now it's just Singapore and the US. And the next country that's likely to come online is the UK. They have multiple applications and the policies in place. I can tell you that the last company to come online or area, I should say, is the EU. They are traditionally very pro-tradition, which often translates to anti-innovation. They're not explicitly anti-innovation, but as a regulator, often the EU is the last to sort of come online for new foods. But APAC nations are going to be the sort of probably dominant area. Protein consumption is in high demand, and they are very accepting of new technologies. So this is where a lot of companies are focusing, but everyone wants an approval in the US first. The FDA and USDA are the gold standard for regulatory approvals, whether you like them or not, and I happen to think they're very good. So everyone's coming for an approval. So FDA is inundated right now with approval requests for their products, because once you get FDA's approval, you can export basically to any part of the world.
Interesting. Now, people are going to say, well, what's the science behind the results? Tell us what long-term studies have been done or are currently ongoing regarding the safety of eating cultivated meat.
So between Singapore and the US, two federal agencies have effectively evaluated for safety, both FDA and USDA. So there's been, I think people forget that often FDA and USDA are independent auditors. They're like peer reviewers, and it's scientists and doctors that are evaluating the data at FDA. A team of about 30 people at FDA of various backgrounds evaluated the Upside product, the Good Meat product, the current products. And then USDA, another large team of people evaluated for use in food and all of the specific technological analyses. And they both have concluded those products are safe. There's explicit guidance. So in terms of long-term studies, those will eventually exist. These products are new in the sense it's a new production method, but they're not new products. I mean, it's the same product as I was saying earlier. So from a molecular point of view, it's interesting. When like General Mills installs a new cornflake stamping machine, we don't ask, are the cornflakes that are coming out, what's the long-term health effects of the production method? But for cultivated meat, it's just a different production method for the same product. So to me, it's a new cornflake stamping machine. You're still producing the same product. And frankly, the FDA and USDA have signed off on it and did one of the longest safety reviews in terms of comprehensiveness and then in terms of time as well for these products. So, and they came to the conclusion, this is meat. And so is USDA. It's got the stamp of approval. This is meat. So time will tell, but I'm fairly confident they will come to the same conclusion 10, 20, 30 years from now.
So, last word, since I know you're super busy, we're going to wrap it up. What would you say to all the skeptics out there regarding the future of cultivated
Yeah,
meat?
to the skeptics of cultivated meat, first I want to say, like, I hear you. Like, I know you're not used to hearing this from a guy working in technology, but I used to be a federal regulator, and I've heard it all. Like, I've been on the other side of the equation. I hear your skepticism. I don't want to dismiss it. It is hard to try something new, especially when it comes to food or what you perceive as new. Cultivated meat is not new; it's just a new production method. What I implore you to do is try it. With the bans that have happened in Florida and Alabama, and partial bans in Iowa, and probably many others that will eventually just be overturned by the federal courts. Um, I see a form of protectionism, and also just I think people scared to think that their way of life, ranchers, producers, or whatever, may go the way of the dinosaur or the dodo. When I don't think that's the case necessarily up front. And most importantly, I would just implore them to try it. Like I just I think I've never seen a person try it, and have had some of our most ardent, I would say, like, want to hate these products come in from the meat industry, and try these products and go, this is meat. This is good. So I think the ultimate proof point is try it. But I want to acknowledge that, in general, skepticism is healthy, but dismissal is not healthy. So come on down, come find a cultivated meat company, and when it's available, I urge you to try it, and then, give your honest feedback.
Eric, what a great interview. I can say that this is certainly this is the future of the meat industry, whether it's in a year, 5 years, 10 years. This is clearly the future for all the reasons you mentioned, that this is the best path forward. There is a lot of skepticism, as I'm sure you're aware of, and as I was playing devil's advocate. People are scared of anything new, especially like you said, when they're eating it, and it's just going to take time. It's like anything else. You're going to have to slowly break down the barriers. People got to try it. It's got to be sold in restaurants. There's got to be more long-term studies, not because it's needed, but just people are going to be requiring that to break that barrier of, okay, this didn't come from an actual full animal. This was grown in a lab, and there's a lot of fear. So I think that, all the work that your company has done is incredible. The work that you and your team has done is remarkable, and kudos to all that you've done. It's clearly the step forward when it comes to the
I
food
appreciate
industry.
that. I also agree. I think your analysis and summary is pretty accurate.
Well, keep up the great work. And I haven't tried it yet, but I certainly do want to try cultivated meat. I'm based off everything you're saying. There's no reason
And
why
thank
not.
you. You're the one person that could have gotten away with asking this, but thank you for not asking about, can you cultivate human meat or what have you. Um, so I'll make sure to send you some chicken, if or something.
Yes, please do. Yeah, let's keep the Hannibal
Agreed.
Lecter out of this. All right, thanks,
Thank you.
Eric. Really appreciate your time.